Welcome to the final episode of our 12-part Resilience Advantage webinar series. I'm your host, Evan Reese. Over the past year, the U.S. Resiliency Council and our series sponsor, Optimum Seismic, along with more than 50 science, engineering, government, business, and nonprofit leaders, have brought you these programs to show how resilience has become an essential part of the movement to achieve sustainability, safety, and the protection of our economy in the face of ever-increasing natural disaster threats worldwide. The diversity of the experts and projects featured on the Resilience Advantage reflects how the performance of our buildings during earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and wildfires affects everyone: building owners, tenants, our workforce, the financial industry, and our communities. The interest we've had in the Resilience Advantage over the past year, from the thousands of attendees at our webinars and viewers of these episodes, to the enthusiasm generated within the public and private sector, has demonstrated the power of the growing resilience movement that our series represents. We are re-envisioning what sustainability means and requires of the built environment. One of the key objectives of this series has been to deliver practical and timely strategies to make both our new and older buildings more resilient in ways that are both achievable and affordable. Given the advances in engineering and product innovation, being resilient just makes good economic sense. And with incentives that can spread the cost of retrofitting and performance-based design among all those who benefit from a more resilient built environment, the upfront costs don't have to come from just one source. When we launched the series in conjunction with the Great Shakeout at our press conference in 2020, our intention was to bring to light the knowledge of what resilience means and how that meaning has evolved. We looked at the common threads in different sectors that, when combined, showed a more holistic and more hopeful view of how we can achieve resilience and sustainability, no matter what the threat. In this episode, we will share some of the many highlights for the past 11 months and show how each episode came together around the theme of making our world more resilient. If there's one thing that 2020 and 2021 has taught our country and communities, it is that disasters often hit us without warning and can have catastrophic effects if we're not prepared. The COVID pandemic, wildfires in the West, hurricanes in the South, and record floods in the Northeast have made it abundantly clear that, as we've said many times in this series, disasters are a matter of when, not if. And if it's a challenge in California to imagine how we can prepare for the big one on the San Andreas Fault, imagine if the threat came from an unanticipated source.
The state is laced with many faults of many orientations. To pull one out of a hat that would be important, the Newport Inglewood Fault, which gave us the 1933 Long Beach magnitude 6.5 earthquake, that ruptures all the way through central Los Angeles, right up to Century City and Beverly Hills. And there it joins the Santa Monica Malibu Fault, which heads west, and the Hollywood Fault, which heads east. The consequences of even a small earthquake on those faults is much higher than the San Andreas.
With San Diego having a longer fault rupture potential, we're now looking at earthquakes that are going to impact not just communities, but regions. And those regions are going to be stretched not only in damage, but also in response. Resources are now going to be taxed when the community that's been affected is much greater.
No matter where the threats come from, we have to ask ourselves, are we really ready?
You know, there's something fundamentally challenging about being ready for natural disasters. They happen in human history on a longer time scale than we're used to managing. We go through this cycle again and again of preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. The worst thing after a disaster is knowing what you should have done and didn't do beforehand in order to lessen its impact.
You're asking people to think about things that they don't like to think about, and especially when they think about their property, which is usually their largest financial asset, and that it might be at risk or exposed in terms of seismic risk. You start to see light bulbs go off, and I think that's really important because, you know, getting the public behind this, getting consensus around thought about seismic safety is huge.
We've stressed throughout the Resilience Advantage that good governance at the local, state, and national levels, and resilience investment by the private sector are essential if we are to ensure that natural peril events do not become disasters.
We will not be able to respond to disasters but for governance, in other words, the collaboration of the various sectors coming together at various stages, pre and post disaster, to address the issue. Indeed, government actually has a substantial role in this orchestra of various actors coming together to govern.
It's a sobering reality that these impacts of natural disasters are increasing in the United States and around the world as a function of both climate change and infrastructure growth in high hazard areas.
There's no question that the impact on communities is no longer something that we can't focus on or only focus on in terms of relief. You know, maybe if it only happened truly once every 100 years, you wouldn't have to think so much about resilience.
We've seen with disasters like Superstorm Sandy in 2012 and the twin Christchurch earthquakes in 2010 and 2011 that when hurricanes or earthquakes destroy tens of thousands of buildings, the debris generated contributes enormously to negative environmental impacts by releasing toxic chemicals into the environment and causing the need to replace and rebuild potentially millions of tons of destroyed materials. Thus, resilience and green design are not separate, but rather complementary halves of the sustainability equation.
There's a Venn diagram of sustainability and resilience, and I think there's a significant amount of overlap. To me, in order to be a truly sustainable society or have a truly sustainable building, that means that it's resilient. That's how it's going to be sustained long term.
The good news is that professional architects and engineers are incorporating resilience into their designs as an integral component of their sustainability practices.
We're seeing that a focus on resiliency is really complementary to what we're already doing with LEED, and it's also becoming prevalent in how our clients are looking at their projects, how they design spaces to connect with their people, to support their people, be able to operate their businesses, and be able to respond in case there is some type of a catastrophic event.
One of the key objectives of the U.S. Resiliency Council is to communicate to the public and building stakeholders that the engineering science behind resilience is mature and capable of making our new and older building stock better able to withstand the current and future risks of natural hazards.
Over the last about 20 years, we've gone from being able to design buildings for safety objectives to being able to evaluate buildings looking at damage and looking at damage to individual components in the building, and doing that in a very complete way so that engineers can design to limit that damage and to get buildings to be functional more quickly after an earthquake.
We've discussed with nationally renowned structural engineering experts and researchers how older structures, including unreinforced masonry buildings, non-ductile concrete and steel structures, tilt-up construction, and soft-story wood frame buildings, have been shown to be particularly vulnerable to the effects of earthquakes, potentially putting millions of lives and billions of dollars at risk. By testing the performance of these buildings using shake tables and computer simulations, we found ways to preserve and mitigate these buildings rather than replace them. We learned about companies that have created innovative products that protect buildings from the devastating effects of earthquakes, demonstrating that high technology isn't limited to phones and cars, but it can be employed on a building scale. The USRC's mission is to develop rating systems that measure and communicate building performance in natural hazards, including earthquakes, hurricanes, flood, and wildfire.
Rating systems are extremely important. They convey to the public what these buildings actually do in a natural disaster. So knowing that the U.S. Resiliency Council is actively looking at buildings and putting placards on there, so when you walk in, you know that this building is safe. It's very similar to the same public information that we did when we started seeing green buildings, and you'd see a LEED silver or a LEED gold placard, and you thought, oh, they thought about sustainability as you walk in that door.
In the same way that the LEED rating system has had a tremendous impact on the market for green design around the world, rating systems that measure resilience will drive both the private and public sectors towards true sustainable design.
Public policy research shows that rating systems, they can powerfully influence market behavior, not just by giving people more and better information when they make decisions, but in a way that's less coercive, you know, not necessarily passing a law and telling people what they have to do. People start wanting to build, serve, produce differently because they know they're going to be rewarded for offering that better product, because the fact that it's a better product is easily visible to the consumer.
One of the biggest misconceptions that we've tried to dispel through the Resilience Advantage is that code compliance is synonymous with resilience.
Going back to this theme of our building codes and the focus on safety, if we don't focus on usability or repairability, that could be a potential scenario, meaning you have a major earthquake in an urban center like Los Angeles, where, you know, we don't expect the number of fatalities to be very high, but you could foresee a situation where some percentage of the population are not able to reoccupy their homes after the earthquake.
As we saw over the course of the Resilience Advantage, both private and public sector owners are recognizing that it's not enough just to ensure that new projects meet the minimum safety requirements of building codes. When it comes to essential services necessary for a business or government agency, the ability to remain operational can be critical. And it is vital that the entire project team comes together with that goal in mind. An example of this type of collaboration occurred with the Clifford B. Allenby building in Sacramento, a new office building for state employees that will be providing essential services to communities after a disaster.
Everybody got on board really quickly. I think the contractor was really excited to be involved in this, really excited to be able to build a building that is resilient and be a part of that, sort of pushing the industry forward in that direction. The architect also was very excited about it too. ZGF is a leader in their field and they're trying to push the sustainability forward, and I think them understanding that this building was going to perform after a large event sort of plays into that long-term sustainability goals of the project that maybe couldn't be sort of quantified in any other way.
Another misconception is that resilience is only accessible to the wealthy or to large companies that can afford to invest for the long term. Casa Adelante, a 9-story, 100% affordable senior housing apartment building in San Francisco, dispels this myth. The project structural engineer was able to integrate new technologies into the design of the building, so that for an additional investment of less than 0.25% of the building's construction cost, this award-winning project will provide a home that is not only safe, but livable after even the largest events expected in the Bay Area. While some developers are recognizing the opportunities to design new buildings to be safe and functional after a major disaster, in any city like San Francisco or Los Angeles, 80 to 90% of the building stock was built before our modern codes were developed.
Existing buildings are a huge part of this issue. In fact, I often think there's far too much focus on new buildings. 1 to 2% of our buildings are new on an annual basis. We tend to focus on that and focus on the code that addresses those and very little on the existing building stock. You know, from a sustainability standpoint, the highest and best use of an existing building is to find out how to use what's already there.
One of the core messages behind the Resilience Advantage is that resilience is good business. We've talked about owners and developers seeing the direct financial benefits of preserving their assets and their businesses through mitigation and resilient design. Reducing liability should also be a major incentive for owners to reduce the risks that potentially vulnerable buildings are posing.
Even though you didn't have to comply with a local ordinance, there was still the law of general negligence. You as a building owner, as a property owner, notwithstanding the fact the city had set compliant dates way into the future, as a building owner, property owner, you still owed a duty to people to make sure that you took necessary and reasonable steps to make the building safe. You couldn't just sit back and do nothing. You had to know your building and you had to know what was necessary to do to bring it into a safe condition.
That's why every owner of an older structure, like the 5 types we mentioned previously, should have their building evaluated by a structural engineer.
My first advice would be don't talk to your lawyer. talk to your engineer, talk to your architect, talk to someone who can tell you what the condition of the building is. Get to a structural engineer, to an architect, to an expert who can identify potentially dangerous conditions on the property and can identify what the remedies are for mitigating that possible problem.
From large projects like the seismic retrofit of the UC Berkeley Memorial Stadium or the Anheuser-Busch factory in Northridge, to historic hotels in the heart of downtown Portland and the California Central Coast, to soft-story affordable apartment buildings in Los Angeles, the Resilience Advantage has highlighted the diversity of building owners that are making the choice to invest in resilience to protect their building occupants, their property values, and their businesses. One of those projects was the Society Hotel in Old Town Portland, Oregon. The 100-year-old historic, unreinforced masonry building was completely renovated and seismically retrofitted. The restoration of the hotel has not only made it safe, it has also revitalized the neighborhood in which it's located.
It's a real catalyst project for the neighborhood, I believe, because as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many other buildings of its vintage in the neighborhood which have not been upgraded yet, and they would like to. And I think our project provides real guidance for a way that that can be done. And after we completed our project, dozens of buildings transacted, sold, and some were renovated. And one right around the corner did a similar renovation, and we're very proud of that. And we'd love to see as many of the buildings in Old Town be preserved as possible.
We never want to lose sight that our buildings serve a larger purpose to create communities and support the people that live and work in them. Throughout this series, we've always tried to tie the science and engineering of resilience back to how these tools make our communities safer and better able to withstand the inevitable occurrence of natural hazards, so that these events do not become disasters.
And the way that we look at protecting communities is by trying to figure out how can we ensure that infrastructure and housing is in a better condition, that it is fortified, that it is braced and bolted, that there is infrastructure in the community that's flexible. Reducing infrastructure exposure will equate to a safer community when there is an earthquake. Avoiding disaster and avoiding the trauma of disaster should be our primary focus in this nation. The avoided costs of a disaster should be a preeminent concern when we're considering investing in infrastructure and housing.
Obviously, at the heart of it, we start to measure our performance not just in terms of safety, but in terms of how quickly we can return to function. So the concept of functional recovery is something we will adapt to. We're going to look at it from a community services perspective and say we need these sorts of services in this amount of time.
Communities that are being successful in achieving resilience recognize that it takes everyone, both the public and private sectors, to embrace their role and contribute resources to the effort.
So resilience is really a community effort. We as a city, I as a city, the mayor as a city, can't do it all alone. It really takes partnerships, and resilience really builds on itself. When businesses are able to continue, then they're able to continue to pay taxes to the city, which go towards police and fire and emergency services and fixing the roads. And it really is important when we think about long-term resilience to think about the economic consequences of earthquakes and how that's going to affect not only individuals and families, but how it's going to affect businesses and city and society in general.
What I would say is many people need to really think bigger about the consequences of earthquake and vulnerable buildings. It's not just about losing the building. There is a cost that is attached to that, obviously. And the cost of paying for retrofit versus losing your building, losing your business, potentially having employees, customers, clients lose their lives, and the liability that's attached to that, that's something that could change someone's life for the rest of their life.
We have highlighted cities such as San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Santa Monica, which have translated the understanding of their risk and the need to mitigate it into concrete policies and ordinances that have dramatically reduced the number of vulnerable properties in their communities.
Santa Monica was successful in having their seismic retrofit program initiated and passed by the community and city council, mostly because of the recognition of seismic risks to the city and the greater need for continuity and resilience. It's recognized that each city could be on their own for several days, if not several weeks, and resiliency is the key.
The USRC, as part of its mission, is working to demonstrate that it is not just mandatory ordinances that can motivate investments in resilience. Studies conducted by FEMA, the National Institute of Building Sciences, and the USRC itself have shown that resilience is pure and simple good for business.
We've shown affordable housing projects in downtown San Francisco can be built for higher seismic performance for zero increase in construction cost. We've shown how projects throughout the West Coast for schools, for other institutional facilities can be done for higher seismic performance for 1% or less increase in construction cost. Don't fall into the trap of thinking this higher performance comes with a big price tag.
Retrofits of existing vulnerable buildings ultimately make our built environment safer and protect our economy. The National Institute of Building Sciences found that investments in better than code design or in hazard mitigation return between $3 and $13 for every dollar spent in terms of property and lives protected and the social and economic preservation of our communities. The good news is that thanks to engineering innovation, achieving resilient performance of our new and existing buildings is both practical and affordable. Whatever measure you use, the benefit is clear. When a building is made more resilient, the benefits ripple out beyond just its owner and tenants, including the lenders and insurers and the community at large. That's why the USRC believes it's essential that these larger groups of stakeholders who benefit from resilience contribute to investments in it. This is echoed by our business leaders.
Well, I think one of the ways that we're going to get our businesses to actually retrofit is finding incentives, whether it's a private-public partnership or it's a city-funded program or it's coming from some of our larger utility companies, or, and I think that's the most important thing right now is to create support so it does happen.
If there's a way to fast-track the permitting that shows a public and private partnership where the city acknowledges that they're making these changes because they're creating safer buildings for the community, safer buildings for employees, safer buildings in our city, that there really shouldn't be red tape there or long drawn-out processes.
Preparation and resiliency has never been more key to our business community's survival. We must be resilient to ensure our buildings stand, our economy hums, and our employees are safe, first and foremost. We must safeguard our investments, our region, and all who live right here. When a building collapses during an earthquake, an owner or a leasee is left with no operating business, the communities face further extensive economic damages, and workers lose their livelihoods. These impacts of these events can be prevented, and that's why we all stand here today.
Despite the challenges of producing the Resilience Advantage series over this past year during COVID, meeting even virtually with so many experts in the field of resilience and moderating some fantastic panels during our webinars has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. I'd like to personally thank all of those that have been part of making this series a success, including our major partners, panelists, the series producer Compassion Unlimited, and our series sponsor Optimum Seismic. We hope that through this series you've gained a better understanding of why resilience is such a vital priority for our communities and our businesses, particularly now. What we've been able to learn and share is that we must all be involved in making decisions that impact our resilience. When individuals and groups work together, change can happen. And change can happen in any cities or estates across the country when the knowledge is shared and a path forward is clear. I hope that you'll reach out to me through the U.S. Resiliency Council to discuss how you can be a part of this growing and powerful resilience movement. To me, the themes of the Resilience Advantage can be summed up in the USRC's E4 principle: engineering in the service of equity, the environment, and our economy. We're pleased to announce that beginning in 2022, we plan to continue with new Resilience Advantage programs focused around this principle, with different and innovative ways to communicate, including podcasts, webinars, and yes, in-person events. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next year as we continue on the path to a more resilient future.